because I think this will come up a lot in this conversation, is that politics was just done very differently, or quite differently anyway, in the late 18th century. But we'll get to all that in time.
For sure.
So, do you want to start with maybe his father, or I'll let you take the reins. How do you want to start?
I mean, I entirely agree. It's impossible to understand the Younger without seeing him through the prism of who was Pitt the Elder. And his father, Pitt the Elder. So the Pitts, I think, is the best place to start. The Pitt family had had inklings of influence in the courts since the time of Elizabeth and James I. But it's not really until Pitt the Elder's grandfather, Thomas, nicknamed Diamond Pitt, came back from India with a great fortune behind him, that he sort of laid the foundations for them to become a real family of prestige and standing. And Pitt the Elder was, by all accounts, it sounds like a bit of a cliche, but he was the Churchill of his time. He was a wartime prime minister during the largest global confrontation that Britain had been embroiled in at that time, in the 7 Years' War. And his nickname, his moniker, was the Great Commoner, because he refused to take a title. And he was very much seen as a man apart from the establishment, who was fighting for the common interests of the English and the British, who'd sort of grown up in this system that had been created since the Acts of Union in 1707.
Yeah, so the Pitt family were, as you say, before Pitt the Younger's father, was sort of squire level. Yeah. Would you say something like that?
Yeah.
But they'd had sort of men in Parliament for quite a few generations, as you say, but never raising to become sort of great statesmen or anything. Then his grandfather, Thomas Diamond Pitt. I'm sure you know the story, but anyone out there who doesn't, he came back from India. He'd bought a diamond in India, some sort of giant diamond, for tens of thousands of pounds, but then sold it for hundreds of thousands of pounds when he got back to Europe.
Yes.
And so this squire family suddenly find themselves sort of immensely wealthy. 100, 200 grand in the sort of mid 18th century is a giant fortune, isn't it? A giant fortune.
Enormously.
And you needed lots of money back then to get into politics, more so even than now, because American politics is quite different to British politics. In American politics, famously, you need lots and lots of money to run for Congress or the Senate. Britain nowadays isn't like that. There's a cap, isn't there? You're really not allowed by law to spend all that much money on campaigning. But that's now. In the 18th century, it wasn't the case. And this is one of the very sort of profound differences to today's politics, is that the electorate was much, much smaller.
Yes.
But bribery was much, much more pervasive. So in other words, you bribed your way into Parliament, like a lawful type of bribing. You just give people lots of gifts and drink to get them to vote for you.
Oh yeah, for sure. It was Georgian elections were colourful, I suppose you could describe it as. There's one particular anecdote, I can't remember particularly which borough or constituency it was, but they had 1,500 voters in that constituency. And just to be on the safe side, the patron who was sort of fortifying his seat, as it were, made sure to buy 4,000 kegs of ale just in case. I think it's very fortunate that any of his voters even managed to put one foot in front of the other to put a vote in place. But yes, that was the sort of society that they all grew up in. And it was just seen as the way things were. People were very just accepting. This is one of the things but at the same time, this was one of the things that was so magnetic about Pitt the Younger's father, that he was seen to rise above that. So when he became Paymaster General in the 1740s, it was almost just taken as a given that, you'd be the Paymaster General, but you take a bit for yourself as well. He didn't do that.
Right.
And he made that known in the papers that he didn't do that. He had his his accounts there for people to see that he hadn't been dipping in for himself. He wanted to, and this is something that he'd certainly impress upon his son, and that his son, Pitt the Younger, would live up to, is the idea of very carefully cultivating his sense of public image and how he was perceived by the public at large.
Yeah, one of his nicknames was Honest Billy. For not feathering his nest massively, for not embezzling public funds, in other words, because it was sort of part and parcel of politics. You're sort of expected to do, well, I mean, not expected to do it, but it just was the done thing. Walpole is a great example of something like that. But there's lots of paintings, you say it was colourful. Electioneering was colourful in the 18th century or 19th century even. There's obviously some great paintings by Hogarth showing sort of the uproarious nature of voting. That polls would be open for days on end, and and it was much more venal, corrupt. They had rotten boroughs or pocket boroughs.
Yes.
So you could sort of quite literally buy your way into Parliament. So yeah, very different than it is today. Make a bit of a mockery of democracy as we might think of it, but nonetheless, that was the world they lived in. And so his father.
Right, yes.
Chatham, because you mentioned there that he was sort of known as a champion of the sort of normal working people. But right at the end of his life, did take the title of the Earl of Chatham, the first Earl of Chatham.
Yes.
And so, and the way it works is in English history is that you are known forevermore by your title, even if you spent your whole life untitled. If right at the end of your life you're ennobled or raised to the peerage in some sense, you are forever then known as, well, he's known as just Chatham, or the Earl of Chatham usually.
Yeah, you don't want to dead name him. Right,
yeah, exactly, yeah. But that was right at the end of his life.
Yes. But so just in the context of his account for himself in the 7 Years' War, though, obviously what's so vital about the 7 Years' War is that is the beginning, the essence of bringing both Canada and India under the dominion of the British Empire, which, to paraphrase, John Peterson, that's not an insignificant thing. That's enormous. And in 1759, Horace Walpole, son of Robert Walpole, former Prime Minister, wrote that our bells are rung threadbare with the sounds of victory. It was a very famous quote. And,
it's a year of miracles, wasn't it? Annus Mirabilis, a year of miracles.
Yes.
Captain Wolfe at the walls of Quebec. Quickly just say on the 7 Years' War then, that really did sort of accelerate, a turbo acceleration of Britain becoming sort of a world-spanning global empire, sort of the most powerful country in the world after the 7 Years' War. And Pitt the Younger's father, the Earl of Chatham, Pitt the Elder, was one of the prime ministers during that. And so to describe him as sort of a Winston Churchill of his day isn't much of an exaggeration. He was, after that, he was considered, a national hero on some level, a great statesman.
Absolutely.
And I think Pitt was he born on the actual year of the Annus Mirabilis?
He was born in...
That actual year?
Yes, in May of 1759.
Right. So his whole formative years, his childhood, was that father, daddy, is a great man.
Yes.
And the whole country look up to him as some sort of hero on some level, a political hero.
Papa is a bit of a legend in his own time.
Right.
And yes, so when Pitt the Younger, who is the second son, he's not the eldest, he's the second son.
That's important. Yeah.
Chatham got, which I'm just going to refer to him as from now on. Right. Chatham married quite late, actually, conventionally speaking for the time. He didn't get married until he was in his 40s. And he married Hester Grenville. And the Grenvilles were another very powerful political family at the time. I believe it was William Grenville was the Prime Minister after him, after Chatham resigned in 1760. And so there is enormous weight behind both of his maternal and paternal family. Pitt grew up surrounded by a family of politicians, essentially.
parliamentary aristocracy.
Yeah.
So both his father and his uncle, because Granville was his mother's brother, right? So both his uncle and his father had been prime minister.
Yes. It's not a bad pedigree.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
right.
that'll do something for you.
Yeah.
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 But so essentially, even from the age of 7, there are accounts of Pitt the Younger saying, "I want to be in the Commons like Papa." I couldn't even begin to say, I think I wanted to be a paleontologist when I was 7, and that's changed about 5 times over now. But he said that at 7 and seemed to single-mindedly dedicate himself to that pursuit for the rest of his life. He couldn't intertwine himself or even conceive of the idea of having a life outside of the Commons and public service. But what's interesting and somewhat unconventional about Pitt the Younger's upbringing is his father, Chatham, went to Eton, and he didn't like it. He found it very austere and not very nurturing, actually.
Brutal.
Yes.
I think.
Yeah. So all 5 of his children, including the younger Pitt, were all homeschooled by the family tutor, Edward Wilson. And Pitt was sort of marked from a very young age as being incredibly gifted. People called him adorably called him the Senator or impetuous William. You know, they sort of recognised from a young age that he had an incredible insight for memory and speech.
Yeah, very precocious. I think Chatham said that if you're sort of a delicate boy, going to somewhere like Eton it would sort of break you.
Yes.
And he wanted to nurture sort of the thoughtfulness in his sons, without being too crude. I've seen British public schools, even through the 19th century, that you'd be beaten, maybe even sort of buggered. Buggery and beatings is what you might expect at a public school. So it's, quite brutal, to be quite honest. And he didn't want that for his sons. And of course, well, not of course, but people might not know, Pitt the Younger was quite delicate physically.
Yes.
Quite weak. I think he was quite a sickly child, wasn't he?
Yes, and this is something that he'd have to contend with for most of his life. He inherited from his father gout, which is, of course, that's, one, incurable. It's not getting rid of it, certainly not in the 1700s. And also as we'll see in a little while, the medical thesis at the time for how best to counteract it only compounded the issues of it. But Pitt always had he actually had a very idyllic childhood in many ways. He had a father who absolutely doted on him. His mother was very warm, very compassionate, and very formidable in her own way and politically savvy. When Chatham became Prime Minister again in I believe it was 1768, he had a bit of a mental breakdown. And just to sort of give you an image of the sort of a woman that Pitt's mother was, whilst Chatham was there breaking down and having nervous breakdowns, invariably his wife just took over the correspondence and was constantly writing to ministers. He'd have the final say on what went on, but she was liaising on his behalf to raise herself up to be that moral support that he needed in those dark times. So Pitt's mother was also quite exceptional.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.